Good good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Very warm welcome to this Governors for Schools webinar. Just a couple of housekeeping points before we begin, if I may, this morning. My name is Steve Barker. I'll do a proper introduction in just a second, but I'm on my own this morning as far as the presentation is concerned, but I'm delighted to say that Emma Hawker from Governors for Schools is sitting in the background. So she is going to attempt to answer some of the questions. But if I could ask you, please, if you wouldn't mind using the Q&A panel rather than the chat to put your questions in, it'll be a lot easier for us to manage. If we don't get round to answering all of your questions, I can assure you that, as usual, we will actually follow up afterwards with online responses to you. So no more ado, very warm welcome, as I say, to this Governance for Schools webinar. School finances, the issues for school governance in the summer of 2025 is our focus this morning. My name is Steve Barker, as I said, and that's somewhat flattering, i.e. a very old photograph of me on the screen at the moment. I'm here representing Better Governor, and we're delighted to continue our partnership with Governors for Schools. This is your webinar, so please ask us questions using the Q&A panel if you don't mind as we go along. Make comments. I will do my level best to keep abreast with Emma's kind support. So in terms of the aims that we've set out for the session this morning, first and foremost, I thought it'd be helpful just to outline what I believe the main financial pressures are that are impacting on our schools in the summer term of 2025. Now, you'll see I've put the word England in there. Apologies to any participants in Wales. Obviously, we have separate education systems in England, Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. I'm based in England. Lots of what I say, of course, will apply in Wales, but some of the things I'm quoting are England-centric, I'm afraid. We'll move on and explore key cost pressures and the impact that they actually have on the financial sustainability of our schools. And I think the key reason why we're putting this webinar together for you this morning really is to highlight those issues and how they do impact on sustainability, financial sustainability, because that certainly is a concern for an awful lot of schools right now. And as we try to do in all of our webinars, we'll be focusing on what good practice looks like from a governance perspective in terms of how we as governors, trustees, etc., hold our schools to account for delivering effective financial control. And of course, some of the time now that's against a backdrop of some very challenging financial circumstances for us. Okay, so I thought we'd start with a little bit of a scan of what the headlines are at the moment and some of the things that are actually being talked about in the media as far as school finances are concerned. These are all fairly recent news snippets that I've actually pulled out. And if we start with the top left, Guardian article here. Guardian article, this one's from about a month ago now, quoting that half of England's state secondaries, and when we say state schools, we mean state-funded schools, so that's academies and maintained schools, are reporting they've had to actually make budget cuts as far as their staffing complement is concerned because of the squeeze on budgets at the moment. We've then got an article on the top right, from the Times Education Supplement magazine, and this one, as you can see, goes back to January. Most schools' budgets will fall short in 25-26, unions find, and linked to that, an article from Schools Week that I actually pulled off yesterday, which is titled "Union Anger at Spring Statement Snubbing Schools." Now, of course, there was money for education within the Spring Statement, but most of that is actually going to early years and to high needs, so not a huge amount going to find its way into the vast majority of state-funded schools. And then last but no means least, because I think it is a significant factor for an awful lot of us, is this article also from the Times Education Supplement. And this is reporting on pupil numbers, and I'm fairly certain that an awful lot of you will have experienced huge variations in admissions into your schools in the last couple of years. That shows no sign of abating, and while some schools in certain parts of the country are certainly in a far more positive position than others, there are many, many schools, London particularly is seeing a lot of school closures or planned school closures at the moment because numbers on roll are falling so dramatically. And I know that is replicated in other parts of the country as well. And as I'm sure you're all aware, admission numbers have a very, very significant impact on school funding. If numbers are falling, so is our funding. And my point of adding this one is that compounds a lot of the other issues that some of our schools are actually facing at the moment. So the reality as far as funding is concerned, and what I've done here is actually gone to a recently published Institute for Fiscal Studies report, and I put the screenshot of the front cover on the left-hand side of the screen there for you. And I think this actually puts into perspective some of the issues that our schools are actually facing at the moment. And when I say some are our schools, there will be some of you sitting on large balances, large reserves at the moment, but there are an awful lot that aren't. And I think it's very easy to get sucked into some of the rhetoric that's perhaps coming out of the department at the moment. There is a report that I also found yesterday from the National Audit Office, which of course is absolutely accurate. There's no doubt about that, but it does make sweeping generalizations. And the danger always with generalizations, of course, is they don't apply to everybody. And one of the conclusions that the National Audit Office came to in its report is that they concluded that Department for Education's overall schools budget has actually been protected in real terms, and that the vast majority of schools are sitting on reserves. Well, the vast majority in reality means 2/3, because a third of schools in England at the moment are sitting on deficit situations. And that's an awful lot of schools altogether, of course. So that brings us back to the Institute for Fiscal Studies report. And what this is saying is that total public purse spending on education has fallen by 11%. And you can see what that means in absolute value since 2010, 2011. And we're talking school, maintained school fiscal years here, of course. So, yes, 15 billion is an awful lot of money. And of course, the reality is we haven't always had real terms increases in school funding, which means that the absolute value of the money that is coming into the education system has not kept pace with inflation. And what the IFS has actually reported is that in real terms, for 24-25, which is the period that this report actually refers to, real term spending actually now is back to where it was in 2006, 2007. So you can see, despite inflation, there has been a pretty sizable decline there. Another fact that was actually reported in the IFS study is that educational spend by government now is down to 4% of national income, and that's in comparison to 2010, 2011, when it was up at 5.6. What we do know on the positive front, of course, is that the current government's priorities are very much led at this point in time by spending on early years. And I think one of the difficulties that we have as governors and trustees is that when we hear terms like the education budget is up, the education budget is in a positive state, that doesn't take account of the vast number of draws on that education. I mean, one of the comments I read in the IFS report is that it also includes student loans. Now, a lot of us working in schools as governors wouldn't necessarily take that account. Early years is very similar because, of course, early years isn't just early years reception classes in mainstream schools. It actually includes an awful lot of preschool settings as well. And the big policy direction, policy shift for the current government, of course, is to put a lot of money into funding places in early years for parents, with the intent of getting more people back into the workplace. And of course, the breakfast clubs as well is having a big impact there too. And the last comment that I've actually drawn from the exec summary in the IFS report is that, as we all know, high needs, special educational needs and disability funding is actually a key driver in a lot of schools. We know that numbers of children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities has been dramatically increasing for a number of years now, and funding hasn't kept pace with that, and that is causing a lot of schools quite a lot of financial pain at this point in time. I can see there's a question on the panel at the moment, which I think is an interesting one. Sorry, you haven't put your first name, so I won't say your surname, but somebody with the first name G has actually put a question on saying, is there an argument that it's better for a school to set a deficit budget, certainly rather than consider redundancies that will adversely affect provision? Um, I think you make an interesting point. Legally, schools are not allowed to set a deficit budget. There is actually no such thing as a deficit budget. If you're in a deficit situation, if you're a maintained school, you have to apply to your local authority for a license deficit, and that's just polite speak for a loan. It has to be paid back, and the reality is, of course, that puts the school into even more difficult situation. If you're an academy trust, the Department for Education, formerly this was done through the Education Skills and Funding Agency, the department now, will not let schools set a deficit except in exceptional situations. What they will do is send a team in to look at where cuts can be made, and they have the authority to make cuts. So in my viewpoint, I think it's always better to avoid a situation which potentially means a deficit. I'm a great believer in operating in a culture of no surprises as governors. I'd like to think that worked for school leaders as well. So a deficit shouldn't suddenly just land on our doorsteps. It's something we should see coming. And one of the things I'm going to pick up later in the session is how we perhaps look to avoid that. Okay, what I wanted to do then, I'll put a little bit of a national picture in there for you, but I think this session today hopefully will be of more relevance and hopefully of more use and benefit to you as governors and trustees if we think about it. Well, how does that affect my school? Um, and I think some of the pressures, the direct pressures that we have on our budgets at the moment, and all of these are things that have actually happened since the 1st of April. So this is new. Now, again, a lot of it we knew about, or should have known about, because it's been in the media, the DfE have announced it, etc. But nonetheless, these are pressures on our schools. First one comes under staffing costs, and I think we would always put staffing costs first, because I'm sure, as most of you will be very aware, staffing is always going to be the largest single element of expenditure in any school budget. We'll say a little bit more about that as we go through, but certainly staffing costs are under pressure in our schools at the moment. For national minimum and living wage increases that actually took effect on the 1st of April, we didn't know what level they were actually going to be at. Many schools will not have made adequate budget provision for those, and of course that's also coupled by the employers' national insurance increases. Now, on the national insurance increases, it's worth saying that whilst the government did commit to actually provide support for schools and that this would be fully costed for schools, that did not mean on an individual school basis. And there will be many schools that have been gainers out of this particular move. Similarly, there will be quite a number who have actually lost out. As it happens, both of the schools that I'm chair of governors have not received as much in terms of the support grant from central government to counteract the impact of the employers' national insurance increase. And I'm sure that if you are not already aware, if you ask that question in your schools, you might find that that's a similar situation. With regards to special educational needs and disabilities, we have to still face the situation, of course, that whilst there has been additional funding announced in the spring spending review, is it enough to actually meet the needs of the pupils that we have in our schools? And I think most of us actually recognise that no, it's not. A lot of our special needs money is actually top sliced by local authorities to enhance provision, perhaps to build more schools, etc. Now, in the longer term, that's helpful for the system as a whole, but there is a big gap at the moment, and many of our schools are actually facing the pressures of meeting the needs of children and young people with special educational needs and disabilities. Capital costs are also a consideration. For a number of years now, we have seen a situation where schools have not been able to maintain their buildings to the extent that they would like. Department for Education has put a lot of information out in the last month or so about effective estate management. That costs money, and a lot of us are struggling in our schools at the moment with the financial pressures coming from a whole host of other areas, that the cost of actually maintaining the estate has also gone up, and that is now beyond the reach of quite a number of schools. Early years provision, as you said, big spending increases there, but of course an awful lot of that spending on early years provision goes on funding places for 3-year-olds, etc., which is part of government policy. There's no doubt about that, as we said earlier, but very often that can be within preschools, within preschool settings, rather than nursery classes attached to schools. Most early years in schools is reception only. There are some exceptions to that, of course. I can see there's a comment or a question, sorry, I should say, from Jane on the panel at the moment. Would there be any financial benefit now to becoming stroke joining a MAT? Joining a multi-academy trust is a choice that lots of schools face at the moment. Certainly going back to 2010, 2011, there were financial incentives, there's no doubt about that. For the most part, funding now is actually very, very similar on a per pupil basis in academies as it is in maintained schools. Due diligence is absolutely essential in all situations where you're considering joining a trust, and part of that is actually looking at the financial situation. Go into it with your eyes open, I would suggest. It's not as clear cut as some people might wish us to believe, but certainly there is actually a very big question to ask. And there are a lot of people who would say at the moment, no, there is no financial incentive. It's a different way of organising. It might give you access to resources such as professional development training for staff, etc., at a slightly lower cost, but you have to look at all of the costs of joining a multi-academy trust. And last but by no means at least on this slide, I just want to make a comment about the general inflationary pressures that are out there at the moment. The cost of living increases that we've seen in the last 2 to 3 years, they haven't gone away. We've had some fairly significant wage increases going through in the state sector, and of course in the private sector as well. And the private sector does provide an awful lot of services to our schools now. Things like utilities, food, curriculum supplies, IT support, often now CPD, training and development for staff in schools. All of those are subject to inflationary pressures, some of them in excess of the ongoing rate of inflation at this particular point in time. And I can see one question on the panel from Gavin at the moment. If using a carry forward surplus with the new budget and lessening the next carry forward, is that technically considered a deficit? Most local authorities call it an in-year deficit. That's what the DfE would also recognise it at, Gavin. There's nothing wrong with an in-year deficit because you're using funds that you've still got to actually balance your books. However, I think as governors, and again, you'll hear me say this a little bit later, what we have to be mindful of is that if you spend that money this year, how much longer is it going to last? So, if you're if you're in a situation where you have an in-year deficit now, in other words, you're using funds that you have to balance your budget, what are the implications for that for next year and the year after? So I hope that answers your question okay. Right. Okay, let's move on. I wanted to say a little bit more in terms of some detail on a couple of those elements on the last list. And the first one I want to talk about is staffing costs, just because, as I said to you before, for most schools now, well, not for most schools, for every school, sorry, it is the most significant element of expenditure. And in an awful lot of schools now, we are seeing that edge up to in excess of 80%. There's a lot of schools that I know all over the country who are looking at situations now where their staffing costs are edging nearer and sometimes exceeding 90%. Now, that's not sustainable. And financial sustainability, as I said right at the beginning, is something we do need to think about. Employers' national insurance costs were not universally fully funded on every single school basis. We have to be aware of that. and the pressures that potentially brings into the system. It's just another cost, but it is something else. If we have to pay that, it means there's something else in our budget that we can't actually fund this year, and we either sacrifice that or we find other income. We have, of course, seen with the publication of last year's school teachers pay and conditions document, the government have actually removed the statutory imperative for schools to operate performance-related pay. Now, the impact of that could be it's optional now whether schools actually operate performance-related pay or not, but the impact of that could, of course, mean that we see higher than usual inflationary pressures. In other words, if it's not based on performance, am I automatically entitled to move up a spine point on the pay scales? So that's something, again, I think governors actually have to think about, and that might be a hidden cost of that news that came out last year. We also know that the cost of supply is increasing quite dramatically, more so in certain parts of the country than others, but more and more supply teachers are needed in the system now. We know that we're in a recruitment and retention crisis, and the promises that the government are making about 6,000 extra teachers, whilst we've seen that actually be acted upon in terms of recruitment of those teachers, they're not filtering through into schools yet because they're still training, etc. So we have to be mindful that there's a lot of demand for supply. There are a lot of private companies operating in this marketplace, and they are putting their prices up to match, certainly at least to keep pace, if not exceed inflation at this point in time. And again, costs of supply insurance, which a lot of schools spend money on, we've also seen increase quite dramatically. I'm sorry, I've just spotted a typo on my next line there. I do apologise. Recruitment and retention are certainly still key factors in many, many schools. And of course, the cost of recruitment is highly significant. And sometimes schools, in order to retain staff, are making retention payments. So again, they're just further cost pressures. But all of these things fall under that general heading of staffing costs. But there are some very specifics, which is why I just wanted to draw those to your attention here. And similarly, a little bit more detail on special educational needs and disabilities here. I think it's something that a lot of governors perhaps are not fully aware of, but every school has within its budget a notional budget to meet the special educational and special educational needs and disabilities of their pupils. That's based on the annual school census, of course, where lots of information is actually given to the local authority, to central government, which actually makes those budget calculations possible. There is a statutory duty on the governing boards of all schools to deliver their best endeavours to meet those needs. Now, best endeavours is something that's coming under an awful lot of pressure at the moment, because very often for a lot of schools, certainly those periods around transition from perhaps nurseries or preschool settings into reception classes in school, transitions into Key Stage 2, and also transitions into secondary, very often there is a bottleneck there of applications for education and healthcare plans, EHCPs as they're often called, and schools find themselves in that situation where their best endeavours actually mean that they are spending their own delegated money on meeting the needs of those youngsters with SEND. So the occurrence, shall we say, of schools having to top up SEN funding to meet pupils' needs, it's not new, but it actually is increasing, and more schools now are finding they're spending more of their money supporting the inclusion of children with special educational needs, which of course is, we would all want to be inclusive, but the cost of doing that is causing pressures elsewhere. And as I hinted at this a little bit earlier, local authorities are notionally in charge of the special educational needs budgets for their geographical areas. And therefore it has an impact on academies as well as maintained schools who are directly under the auspices, shall we say, of the local authority. But local authorities are responsible for determining how their high needs spending is actually utilised. And very often now we see an increasing number of local authorities spending that high needs money on out of area private provision, and that comes at a very real premium. It's a much higher cost than if youngsters were to be located in special schools within the authority, or there are now increasing numbers of special schools with multi-academy trusts. The problem that we have in the system is there aren't enough places at the moment, and therefore the private sector is tending to move into that space, but of course at a much, much higher cost. And all that is against the backdrop that pupil numbers, specifically with SEND, continue to increase at a relatively alarming pace. I can see that there's a question on the panel from somebody. Sorry, you've called yourself an anonymous attendee. That's absolutely fine. Question is there any advice for PFI schools where premises utilities equate to 15% of the budget? Sadly, that's a legacy issue, and regretfully, because of those contracts that were actually entered into in those public finance initiatives all those years ago, many of them are still running, and you've said that you've got 7 years left under PFI. Sadly, there's no easy win there. There are some authorities that are actually working with schools to actually help in that situation. But no, I'm sorry to say there is no easy answer to that. Okay, I also wanted to just say a few more things about inflation, because I think these are some of the things that, in terms of that backdrop, we need to be aware of as governors. The big question, of course, is, are the cost increase pressures that schools are under now outpacing the additional funding that is being made available to schools? There's some research that was published in June last year by the National Foundation for Educational Research, and they found that 93% of school leaders had actually already made budget cuts because of the cost pressures that they felt they were under. We've talked about the cost of living crisis and its impact a little bit earlier. That is still being felt within schools. There is actually no doubt about that. I'm constantly reminded of a phrase that Theresa May used to use, sorry, coined, I should say, when she was Prime Minister. She talked very often about the phrase jam, meaning just about managing. The context has changed when she was actually mentioning it, but actually the impact of that on a number of families in all parts of the country, I think, who are only just about managing, or perhaps not managing, is increasing. And we're seeing that spill over into needs in schools, and very often schools are actually the only people filling that void. So increasingly, delegated funding in our schools is being spent on food, it's being spent on clothing, it's being spent on footwear, and lots of other things which ordinarily schools would not have to fund. There's lots of information out there in the public domain and across the media at the moment about the amount that teachers are actually spending. Now, forgive me, I haven't got the number at my fingertips. I don't know how many teachers there are in this country at the moment. It's probably well over, it's got to be a million into the certainly hundreds of thousands, if not millions. But the average teacher is spending over £100 of their own money supporting children in their schools at the moment. That might be bringing food in, it might be paying for clothing, etc. And of course, schools are doing that out of their own budgets as well. And then, of course, we have all of those things that schools buy in as services. That might be IT, it might be curriculum supplies. We've already talked about supply insurance, supply contracts, utilities, repairs, and the list goes on and on. And none of those are we seeing prices standing still at the moment. There are inflationary increases coming through the system all of the time, and schools are having to make very tough decisions about, can we afford that contract? Do we absolutely need that contract? And if the answer is yes, where do we cut spending to enable us to still afford that? So that's a little bit of scenario setting. I think what we need to think about is, well, what does the oops, sorry, my what I thought was clever animation didn't work terribly well there. I do apologise. Um, what does the road ahead actually look like? Well, some of the factors that we need to actually think about, of course, pupil numbers. As I say, there is regional variation across the country on this, but there are an awful lot of parts of the country where pupil numbers are falling, and all of the forecasts are saying that because of migration, because of falling birth rates, those numbers will continue to fall in many areas for a number of years yet. We've got consumer price index, the normal measure for inflation. The last one that was available is actually for March. The April one will be due, I think it's next week, but that's currently running at 5.1%. Now, if all of our costs rise at 5.1%, those difficult decisions about spending priorities are not going to go away. Wage costs, as I intimated earlier, are running ahead in the private sector from where they are in the public sector, but not by a huge amount. 5.7% average increase in the public sector at the moment against 5.9 in the private. And as I say, both sectors have an impact on school budgets, of course. Um, we need to be mindful, lots in the media about the energy price cap. I mean, that has increased by 6%. The energy price cap does not have an impact on schools. They are not protected by it. The advice now from central government, of course, is to shop around for utilities where we're able to, but inflationary pressures certainly are very prevalent in that particular sector at the moment. And then last but by no means least, of course, we have to be mindful that in the private sector, responses to those increases are typically higher than inflation. And when I say the private sector, it's not just the private sector. A lot of local authorities now are trading their services, which is not new. They've been doing that for quite some time. In other words, they're charging schools for those services, but they too are imposing some fairly eye-watering price increases year on year because, of course, they're under pressures because of cuts in their funding as well. I can see there's a comment on the board from Razila, who's saying, are local authorities in deficit and unable to support the maintenance of school premises? We can't access SIF bids. What other options do we have as our finances won't stretch as far to do the basic health and safety aspects we need? That's a good question, Rosetta. I mean, I think you have to bear in mind as a local authority school, ultimately health and safety is actually the responsibility of the local authority. If your school is unsafe, the governors have to actually consider, is it safe to open? In my experience, and I'm not suggesting any form of protest here, but in my experience, making the local authority aware that there is a potential closure because of health and safety concerns will prompt them into action. Whether they're in deficit or not, they have a statutory obligation to maintain the school estate. Just for balance, if you're in an academy situation, of course, that responsibility sits with the academy trust, but academies, of course, are able to make SIF bids. So I hope that answers your question. Okay, so let's move on. This will this won't apply to many schools. Many schools are bigger than this, but I thought it would be helpful just to drop in a very quick scenario here of the basically the percentages of increase and what that means in reality for a fairly typical school. This is a 160 pupil school. It's PAN, its published admission number is 180. So immediately we can tell that this school is actually suffering from falling rolls. They've got 20 spaces, which are not being funded at this particular point in time. But the cost increases that the school is still being faced with on the teaching staff because of the what we know is actually going to be the percentage increase this year. That's going to cost the school an extra £36,000. That includes the national insurance, increased employers' contribution, of course, other staff costs being hit by living wage, etc. Utilities bills because of what we know about the inflation that's there, going through all of the others. And I don't need to insult your intelligence by reading all of these out to you, but you'll see reduced funding, about 60% of the way down there. 20 fewer pupils on roll means a loss of, on average, for this particular school in this particular part of the country, and there will be variations here, but 124,000. So not only you've got all the increased costs, you've actually got that loss of funding as well. And all of that adds up to a situation where this particular school has actually, in essence, got a bill of £203,500. And the reason I put the reduced funding in there is because you've still got the same staff structure, unless you've preempted that and done something about it. But you've actually got to make that staff, so you've got to fund that staff structure. You've actually got to do that with £203,500 less than you had in your budget last year. Now, if you're sitting on a budget of £10 million, you think, well, okay, that's probably doable. If you're sitting on a budget of £1 million, which a school of this size probably is, it's not doable. And we're talking about some very real questions about financial sustainability. So what that leads us to is a few questions as governors. Well, what should we do as governors? And I think for me, and this comes back to some of those questions which I've seen coming through on the panel already, the biggest imperative in my mind is that as governors, we need to ensure that we do understand our budget, we understand what assumptions our budgets are actually based on, and we understand what that means in terms of our sustainability model, shall we say, going forward. And when I say those budget assumptions, the most significant budget assumption, of course, is what number of pupils have we predicated the current budget on? Uh, it's very easy for us as governors to look at a budget and say, okay, we had £4 million last year, and we're going to get 4,100,000 this year. But actually, if that 4,100,000 is a prediction, which is a positive one, but it's actually based on flawed pupil numbers, if we know admissions in the area are falling dramatically, do we have a degree of certainty that we will still be full as a school? Schools that have been full and oversubscribed for many, many years are now finding themselves in situations where that's not the case. And on average, every pupil place, it varies from phase of education and area, of course, is worth between £6,000 and £8,000. So if you lose 20 pupils at £6,000 each, then that's £120,000, and so it goes on. You can do the maths for yourselves there, but we have to think about those the assumptions on pupil numbers because they are fundamental to that budget projection. We have to think about staff changes. Are we as governors aware of what head teachers and senior leaders are thinking about with regard to the future and what the staffing structure might look like? Do we know that we've got teachers coming up to retirement or teachers who are at that stage of their career where they might be moving on? Is there an opportunity there for cost saving? Would we replace somebody who's on the upper pay spine at the moment with a early framework career teacher? Because there are significant savings to be made, certainly in the short term there. Do we change the staffing totally? Do we have to think about possibly reducing the number of teachers, reducing the number of teaching assistants? So we might see natural wastage there. We may have to think rather more harshly. And of course, inflation is always part of what we're looking at, and we should actually, as governors, understand what assumptions have been made about inflation in the creation of the budget that's presented to us. Coming back to the question, I think it was Imad, sorry if I've got the name wrong, I'm not good at names, I'm afraid, but the question that was asked earlier about reserves, know if your school or if your trust is actually using reserves it's got at the moment to balance the budget. That's a warning light. That's somebody banging a big drum very loudly in our ears to say, hang on a minute, we're into Mr. McCorber territory here. We're living beyond our means. That is not sustainable in the long term. It might be sustainable this year, it might be sustainable next year, but as governors, we have to understand the implications of that. be aware, and obviously that links to this next bullet point about being aware of how long reserves will last on our current based on current spending patterns. That's why it's crucial, and you'll hear me say this again a little bit later, that as governors and trustees, we are aware of what the 3-year plan, the 5-year plan looks like. When we're doing our budgets, are we looking at year one? Are we looking at year 2 and 3 as well? Because actually, if we are projecting continuing our spending as we are, that gives us sometimes a very stark reminder of what the precipice actually will look like and when we'll be looking into it, because lots of schools see a deficit situation being forecast in year 2 because your reserves have run out, but do nothing about it until they get there. And that comes back to the comment I made earlier about wanting to operate in a culture of no surprises. That should not be a surprise when that happens. As governors, we should anticipate that, and we should start thinking, if we've just approved a budget in a maintained school, which most schools will have done in the last couple of weeks or so, if that budget shows us to be in a structural deficit, in other words, we won't be able to balance our books at the end of next year, 2026-27, we need to start acting about it. We need to start asking our schools, what are we doing? When are we going to review our staffing structure? When are we going to look at opportunities to generate more income, etc.? We need to absolutely, as governors, take on board the fact that staffing, all staffing that is always going to be the largest single cost element in our budget. We should also know what that means in terms of the percentage of expenditure there. As I say, there are some schools now who are dangerously close and some even slightly above the 90% mark. I have been a governor for quite a few years. I can remember when the DfE used to advise staffing should account for between 70 and 75% of your budget. They don't say that anymore, of course they don't. But the problem is that was true, and it's still true today. Without additional funding coming into schools, if we're spending upwards of 80% of our budget on staffing, there will be a lot of things that we're not able to afford, and that does impact on that sustainability long term. And also, as governors, we should be asking, there's nothing impolite about this, this is actually us actually fulfilling our role. We should be asking what plans are in place or what plans are being considered to either reduce costs or look to sourcing additional revenue, additional income. And I've deliberately put it in that order because most of us will look to cutting our costs first before we're able to perhaps really think about raising income elsewhere. Gavin's asked another question here. With the 80% staff cost benchmark, are supply costs in that or outside? They are normally covered within that because, and they quite rightly should be, as should recruitment costs. Most local authorities and most academy trusts, in my experience, run what's called a CFR, consistent financial reporting model, and therefore all of the costs that relate to staff should be correctly included in the overall staffing budget. And you will see when you look at your financial monitoring reports, you will see that there are probably 15, 20 different lines there. Supply will definitely be one of them. So previous slide was what we should do. This next slide is, well, what could we do as governors and trustees? And I think these are, when I say what we could do, what I mean is what we could ask to be done. This is not a call for us as governors to get involved operationally in our schools. This is a call for us to be asking some very tightly focused, strategically oriented questions about the future, about avoiding financial situation that does actually impact on our sustainability. So the first one of those is that we should perhaps, if we know what our budget looks like this year, we have just about balanced it, but only because we've used reserves and we're moving into a potential deficit in year 2, we should be looking at cost cutting. We should be modeling different scenarios. Have we thought about that? Have we thought about going back to basics in terms of looking at the way in which our models are actually created from a budgeting perspective? Lots of schools take last year and increase the costs across the board. They don't go back and say, well, if we were starting from scratch, how would we organise the school? How would we source some of the resources that we actually need? And part of that, of course, the biggest resource we need comes back to staffing yet again. Has the school ever thought about exploring alternative staffing models? Now, alternative staffing models could be about vertically integrated classes, so split year groups. It could be about a different staffing structure in the morning to the afternoon. It could be about the deployment of teaching assistants. It might even be about employing HLTAs, higher level teaching assistants, to actually supervise classes which are overall led by one teacher over more than one class. There are lots and lots of different models out there. Clearly, the role of governance is to balance some of those cost-cutting opportunities or those cost-saving opportunities with the need to deliver a high-quality education and care package to all of our pupils. But nonetheless, we still have the challenge of balancing our budget, which, of course, is what this is all about. We could ask our school to explore cost reduction on non-staffing areas, such as energy, other consumables, etc. Now, we have to be mindful, and the reason I've put this as third in the list is because the others absolutely come first, because the biggest proportion of money in our staffing means the biggest single impact we're going to have is changing our staffing costs. The others, we're actually working at the margins, and very often the cost savings here are incremental, notwithstanding obviously the dramatic increases we've seen in energy costs. But things like investing now to actually save money in the future, those are some of the things that I think governors should be pushing schools to. Putting solar panels in, what impact could that have? Yes, there's a capital cost now. Maybe there's a grant we could actually explore for as far as that's concerned, but what are the potential savings in the longer term? And the idea of short-termism is probably part of the school landscape by necessity at the moment. But actually, as governors, we're the ones with that perhaps lay perspective, we're coming in from outside, we should be asking those questions that mean that schools could explore other alternatives, that there could be some potential cost savings. And the reality is, yes, of course, we want to make considerable savings if we can, but even savings at the margin are better than no savings at all. And then last on my list there, again, just because it's probably more challenging for most of us to do, is the idea of exploring income generation elsewhere. We know that revenue, the money that we receive primarily from central government, although in maintained schools, of course, that's passported through the authority, we know that that is relatively fixed. But locally generated income, and I'm sorry to those people who are in PFI schools, because your scope for action in terms of lettings, etc., is very limited there, of course, but there are always fundraising things that schools can do outside of that. So just before we move on to a couple of examples, before we finish the session this morning, I just wanted to focus on what I believe are some of the good practice hints, tips, whatever you want to call them, elements of financial sustainability. And I keep coming back to this phrase. Financial sustainability is what we're talking about here. We want our schools, we want our trusts to still be here in 5 years' time, in 10 years' time. We want them to still be providing the best quality education, the best quality care for all of our pupils. So we need to think about the challenge that we bring as part of our accountability role as governors, and we need to use that to deepen our level of understanding of our schools. We need to think about ratios of costs. We need to get ourselves involved in benchmarking. We need to use that information so that we understand and we make better decisions as a consequence of that. We need to ensure that school data, all data, pupil data, finance data, staffing data, does inform our decision making. We shouldn't accept any longer just making decisions because that's what we've always done. We should be challenging the status quo. We should be asking our schools, are we using data on staffing? Are we using HR data as effectively as we can to inform our decisions and potentially save money going forward? Are we actively seeking new income? Many schools, and say notwithstanding the issues for PFI schools, have vast unused resources that could generate income. schools halls, schools fields, classrooms. There are lots of ways in which schools can actually utilize the resources that they've got, the physical resources, to potentially generate income. Are schools proactive in going out and seeking lettings, etc.? Sometimes they're not. Sometimes we wait for people to come and ask questions. But again, it needs people to do that. But it's something that in the situation that some of our schools are in is actually worth putting some focus on. And in terms of focus, my penultimate point on this slide is focus on good governance. Make sure that our boards are actually populated with governors who've got appropriate financial skills. And I don't just mean people who work in finance, but people who understand budgeting, people who've got a good grasp of numbers, who are analytical in their approach to governance, so that as governors, we're accessing training. We are analysing data that's actually being presented to us. We're scrutinising reports. We're bringing that sense of challenge into play. And above all, of course, we're thinking about succession planning. So every time we recruit new governors, it's not just about putting a rear end on a seat. It's actually about putting, yeah, a pair of ears and a mouth there as well, because as governors we need to be participative, we need to be showing leadership here. Governance is part of school leadership and we need to be demonstrating that, and that's what I mean by good governance. And I also think that research and focusing on our own development is also crucial here. It's about focusing on what's happening elsewhere. It's about knowing what's happening out in the big wide world. And I think that's something that we don't do enough as governors. I mean, hopefully sessions like this and others that governors for schools and other organisations for that matter put on for governors are great for opening our minds to new ideas and sharing ideas of good practice, etc. But we can do some of those things ourselves. We can actually research, we can read about what's happening elsewhere. Um, and I just wanted to very quickly remind you that there are some services out there already. Some are free of charge, some are not. Unfortunately, my first example is one that for most schools probably isn't. Some local authorities may provide budgeting software to schools, some don't, but certainly most academy trusts now will be purchasing or investing in some form of budgeting software. That makes the process easier. It actually makes it a lot more possible to extrapolate and look at what the situation may be in future years, etc. So that's certainly a question worth asking. If you don't know if your school uses budgeting software, ask that question. The Department for Education has spent a lot of time putting resources, partnerships together under the banner of Buying for Schools. So if you Google DF or whatever your preferred search engine is for that matter, the Department for Education Buying for Schools, you will find a vast array of information on procurement frameworks which allow schools to actually make significant savings, allow them to collaborate with other schools, etc. That's certainly worth looking at. There are, of course, HR, human resources and payroll software solutions. The idea is that we're automating a lot of these processes, but also we're actually collecting data out of them. And that could be absence data. It could be a whole host of different things which schools could actually find useful. There's a lot of information out there on school fundraising ideas. It does take time, but actually it can be worth it. There are lots of people out there who are providing access to schools. There are databases of grant-making bodies. Some of them are geographically dependent. So, for example, people like Kellogg's make grants to schools to run breakfast clubs, but they will only do it in certain areas of the country which are defined by the government as being disadvantaged. But there are lots of grants for lots of things. As I say, solar power is a big one at the moment. There are lots of grant-making bodies involved in science projects, etc. So a lot of those things that perhaps we would see as luxuries in our schools now, we can maybe still do them by going out there and chasing grants or looking at other fundraising ideas. I think one of the things we have to think about is how prudent or otherwise we are in terms of financial management. And again, these bullet points on this slide in front of you at the moment are really the foundation of questions that we could go back and ask in our schools if we don't know the answer. One of the things that most certainly is on the on the agenda for academies is the concept of risk appetite. I think that needs to be something we think about in all of our schools now. Yeah. Do we spend money, invest it now? Might be a risk attached to it, but actually it could inform the financial viability, the sustainability of our schools going forward. We need to think about our risk appetite and use it to actually inform spending decisions that we're making. So, for example, we could say, well, we've got 8 classrooms, all with an interactive whiteboard in them. They're all 10 years old now. They might break at any time. We could say, well, yes, but is it worth risking actually not doing it because we'd actually save £28,000 or whatever it might be this year? Those are the sorts of questions where we should actually have a debate as governors. We should be saying, well, yes, but what's the downside? If they do go wrong, that means an impact on the curriculum, that could impact on pupil outcomes. Those are the things that we should be talking about, and perhaps advancing an argument that says it's better to invest now because of the potential savings going forward. So we do need to think about that in the context of risk. We also need to think about where we do have income from other sources coming in. That is invariable. Sorry, that's not good English. In most circumstances, that income will actually be variable. In other words, it's not guaranteed. Lots of schools found they were getting their fingers burnt back in the dark days of the pandemic because suddenly income from lettings disappeared overnight, as did for the most part a lot of donations because charitable activities weren't going on, and therefore there was no money to donate. Lots of schools had been spending significant sums of money, perhaps on TAs, sometimes even on teaching salaries. They found themselves in very difficult situations. We need to avoid that. What we perhaps could consider is using contracts to actually secure income for at least a short period of time. Many schools don't have contracts as such. They literally just say, okay, you can have these premises every Tuesday night, it'll cost this, and we'll send you the invoice. They don't set it up for a minimum of 12 months or something like that. Now, I'm not suggesting we adopt harsh practices or anything like that, but this is the reality now, and I think we do need to think about it. Similarly, when we're thinking about contracts, have we routinely explored fixed term contracts for staff, particularly where we've got lots of children with special educational needs and disabilities? They're only going to be in the school for a fixed period of time. Are we linking people's contracts to those needs of the school, or are we leaving ourselves perhaps with something of a problem moving forward? Reviewing communication strategy, going paper free is always an option. We're not going to save as much money there as we are on staffing, but there could be some significant changes there. And also something which isn't necessarily palatable for all of us, but exploring charging for pupil clubs. Lots of schools run pupil clubs, extracurricular activities, particularly before and after school ones, and make no charge. Making even a nominal charge could cover the staffing costs of those, could actually help on your budget a little bit. Just a couple of ideas. I'm very conscious that the clock is ticking away. I did some research in the last couple of days and I found these two organizations, Third Space Learning and Reach More Parents, both of them are, again, Google, our usual search engine. I'm not suggesting they're all brilliant ideas, but there are some good ideas in both of them. Again, not our job necessarily as governors to actually progress these things, but certainly ask the school, particularly on the Third Space one, have we ever looked at grants for school? Have we ever looked at local grant making organisations within our local community? Very quick example, the infant school rhyme chair. We were precluded back in the pandemic from having any of the free laptops that were being circulated. Government scheme didn't extend it to Key Stage 1. We went to a local charity and they gave us £8,000 for laptops specifically for those children who had no access. And I'm not saying we're groundbreaking that, but it was just something that we did that actually, it was the first time we'd done it, but actually we've established a contact there that is actually useful going forward. Okay, that brings me to the end of all. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to do that. I'll come to that in just one second. all I wanted to say. So if there are any other questions, then do please feel free. As I say, I hope we've answered a number of questions going through. Those that we haven't, I will actually come back to you um, electronically with a response to your questions. We save them all. Just before we disappear this morning, there are two messages I'd just like to share with you, if I may, from on behalf of Governors for Schools. The first one, and don't be put off by the graphic on the left-hand side. There's an organisation, a charitable organisation called Stop Loan Sharks. There is going to be some training made available. This is an organisation sponsored by central government, and the idea is that there is certainly relevance for the school community in understanding this. If you look at that second bullet point paragraph or bulleted paragraph, there's a safeguarding aspect here for the school community. There are very real impacts felt in our schools where people have fallen victim to taking loans from unscrupulous people. That does have a knock-on impact into our schools, and we can see lots of children already suffering because of the impact that this is actually having on their parents, on their home life, on their attendance in school, etc. So just please make a note of that and look out for it. You will see more coming up on that from Governors for Schools in the not too distant future. And last but by no means least, just wanted to make you aware that one of our colleagues at Governors for Schools has actually set up the Sustainability Governor Network on LinkedIn. It's all about um, raising awareness. It's about how our schools, not just from a financial sustainability perspective, but in terms of an ecological, awareness of climate change, etc. Perspective. There are already a number of people signed up to it. I signed up myself yesterday. And I'm going to put a post on it later on today. There are lots of things that are happening in our schools. It's an opportunity to give advice. It's an opportunity to share good practice and experience, etc. Okay, well, I'm sorry, I have run a couple of minutes over. I do apologize, but just wanted to end by saying a very big thank you to you for joining us this morning. Please come back next time. Look out for posts about what other webinars are coming up from Governors for Schools. The sun is just about shining where I am today, so I hope it is where you are too. Please enjoy the rest of your day, and thank you very much once again, and goodbye.